Wow. Welcome to Occidental. My name is Peter Dreyer. I teach in the politics department. And happy anniversary. Did you know that today is an important anniversary in the history of social justice in America? Exactly 57 years ago today, on February 1st, 1960, 4 African-American college students, freshman college students, at North Carolina A&T University in Greensboro, North Carolina, visited the local Woolworths, there they are, and the local 5 and dime store. They purchased some school supplies and toothpaste, and they sat down at the lunch counter, and they ordered coffee. "I'm sorry," said the waitress, "we don't serve Negroes here." The 4 students refused to give up their seats until the store closed. The local media soon arrived and reported the sit-in on television and newspapers. The 4 students returned the next day with more students, and within 4 days, about 300 students had joined the protest, generating even more national media attention. So their action inspired students at other colleges, and by the end of March, meaning 2 months, the sit-in movement had spread to 55 cities in 13 southern states. Many students, mostly black but also white, were arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, or disturbing the peace. And at the time, many Americans thought that these students were too radical. You've heard that before. But their actions galvanized a new wave of civil rights protest, and they started a revolution. In April of that year, 1960, 300 of the sit-in activists came to a meeting at Shaw University in North Carolina to discuss how to keep the sit-in movement going. They became the founding members of the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, called SNCC. And the SNCC activists played roles in the freedom rides, the civil rights marches, the voter registration drives that eventually led Congress to pass the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And many of those SNCC activists became key leaders in later battles for social justice. One of them, John Lewis, risked his life many times. He risked his life many times for social justice, and he's now a member of Congress from Georgia. 2 weeks ago, Donald Trump went on a titter tantrum, and on that Twitter tantrum, he said that Congressman Lewis was all talk and no action. Amazing. Now, there's even an Oxy connection to this story. At that historic meeting in Shaw University, an Occidental College graduate named Guy Carawan, who's on the right there, he's the white guy. Right. He taught 300 student activists at that meeting a song he had written, actually a song he'd revised, called "We Shall Overcome." Guy Carawan graduated from Oxy in 1949. His earliest performances involved singing and playing the ukulele as part of a singing group with his fraternity here at Oxy, ATO. Are any ATO people out there? Okay. Okay. Now, Guy majored in math, but yay for math, okay. Okay. But he took a class in folklore, and that class inspired him to learn more folk songs, spirituals, and union songs. And then he learned to play the guitar, and after his graduation, he pursued a very successful career as a folk singer. He toured around the country and around the world. He recorded many albums, and he wrote several books about the importance of music in the civil rights movement. In the late 50s, Guy Carawan became the music director at a place called the Highlander Folk School, a training center for activists, black and white, in rural Tennessee, and people like Dr. King and Rosa Parks and John Lewis spent time at their workshops at Highlander. And the song "We Shall Overcome" began with the slaves who sang "I'll be all right someday" as a way to give them hope. And then Southern black churches adopted the song and called it "I'll Overcome Someday." And then in 1945, black members of the Tobacco Workers Union in South Carolina revised the song during a picket for a strike, and they sang it, "We will overcome, and we will win our rights someday." A few years later, those union members came to Highlander for a workshop, and that's where Guy Carawan first heard the song. He changed "We will overcome" to "We shall overcome." He also sped up the tempo, he revised some of the words, and he changed some of the chords to make it easier to sing in large groups. And so when he sang that version of "We Shall Overcome" at the first meeting at SNCC to the student activists, they loved it. They sang it along. The song quickly became the anthem of the civil rights movement. Activists sang it on picket lines. They sang it at prayer services. They sang it on the buses during the freedom rides. And they sang it in jail. And then it spread around the world and is now the anthem for human rights all over the world. Guy Carawan spent the rest of his career as Highlander's music director. He helped inject music into the civil rights movement. And probably most of you have never heard of him, but he changed history. In 2003, we invited Guy Carawan back to campus to receive an honorary degree, the same degree that Dr. Barber is going to get tonight. And during that day, he spoke in some of our classes, and that night he performed a concert of his favorite songs in the college chapel. And during the intermission, we held the ceremony and gave him that degree. Guy Carawan represents the best about Occidental. Our mission is to help our students to develop the tools and skills to help make this a more humane and inclusive society. They can be lawyers for justice, doctors for justice, clergy for justice, teachers for justice, planners for justice, artists for justice, politicians for justice, organizers for justice, and like Guy Carawan, musicians for justice. Or like Reverend Barber, who you'll hear in a few minutes, they can be preachers and community organizers for justice. Okay. Another student who developed a commitment to social justice while at Occidental was some guy named Barack Obama. He gave his first political speech just a few hundred yards from here out in the quad in February of 1981, when he gave the opening speech at an anti-apartheid rally protesting the college's investments in South Africa, corporations doing business in South Africa. Well, like Obama, we want Occidental as an institution to reflect the values of social justice. We want Oxy to be a responsible employer, a responsible neighbor, and a responsible consumer. We're proud that Occidental ranks near the top of all the liberal arts colleges in the country in terms of the number of low-income students and the number of first-generation students, many of whom are in this room tonight. We're proud that we've adopted an anti-sweatshop policy for the clothing sold in the college bookstore. And most recently, we're proud that in the face of Donald Trump's attack on immigrants and refugees, we have pledged to be a sanctuary campus. In our classes, we talk the talk, but we also want our students to walk the walk. We have a number of programs that give students opportunities to translate what they learn in the classroom into the real world of politics and social action. And one of those students is Jocelyn Guzman, who spent last summer working in North Carolina and was inspired by Reverend Barber. Remember her name. She is someone who, like Guy Carawan, and like Barack Obama, is going to help change the world. And I'm proud to introduce you to her now, Jocelyn Guzman.
Hello, everyone. Thank you, and thank Professor Dreyer for the introduction. My name is Jocelyn Guzman, as Professor Dreyer said, and I'm a junior here at Oxy. I'm a religious studies major, an education minor, and I'm from Modesto, California. I spent last semester in North Carolina working on the governor's race as a part of Oxy's campaign semester program. The program gives students the opportunity to work on a political campaign full-time and earn a semester's worth of credit while doing so. Professors Regina Freer and Peter Dreyer started the program back in 2008, and I'm grateful to be one of about 100 students to take part in campaign semester since its inception. I have always been interested in the intersection between faith, religion, justice, and politics. Campaign semester gave me the opportunity to see those connections firsthand. I was thrilled to live and work in a state where a leader like Reverend Barber unashamedly used his faith to speak out against injustice and help elect government officials like the candidate I worked for. I worked for Roy Cooper, the Democratic candidate who ran against and beat Republican incumbent Governor Pat McCrory. The race was extremely close, and Cooper only won by about 5,000 votes out of about 4.6 million votes cast. While I and many others were working inside the Cooper campaign to help elect a governor who would create a more inclusive state, leaders like Reverend Barber were working outside the campaign to promote similar values and to mobilize people to vote. Reverend Barber bravely spoke out against unjust policies passed by the McCrory administration. He created and led the Moral Monday protests at the state capitol. He organized voter registration drives. He gave many speeches from church pulpits, union halls, college campuses, and of course, his inspirational speech at the Democratic National Convention. He called for investment in public education, a living wage, universal health care, criminal justice reform, voting rights, women's rights, LGBTQ rights, immigrant rights, and more. He was even arrested for his efforts, a testament to his courage and conviction. One key thing I learned from my experience working inside the Cooper campaign is that democracy works best when there are also people working on the outside, speaking out against injustice and holding politicians accountable. In my humble opinion, there is nobody who does this better than Reverend Barber. Like Dr. King, who spoke on this very stage 50 years ago, Reverend Barber draws on his religious faith to speak truth to power. As a student who studies religion, who identifies as a woman of faith, and who cares about social justice, I admire Reverend Barber as a repairer of the breach, someone who calls out the best of us to unite us and make America a more humane and decent country. The 2016 election season is over, but the fight still goes on. I rest assured knowing that North Carolina is in safe hands, with Roy Cooper in the governor's mansion and Reverend Barber at his pulpit, leading the fight to revive the heart of our democracy. I did not get to meet Reverend Barber when I was in North Carolina, but I'm incredibly thankful that he is here to speak to us tonight at Oxy. I now invite President Veach to the podium to begin the honorary degree ceremony. Thank you.
Good evening. It's my great privilege to award an honorary degree to Reverend Barber this evening. Honorary degrees are given by Occidental College to recognize the extraordinary individual accomplishments across the wide spectrum of human endeavor. As an institution committed to a robust and thoughtful growth of civil society, Occidental awards honorary degrees to those women and men who have made a positive difference in the lives of their and our community, whether on the world stage or more locally, and to honor the manner in which the work of these individuals carries forward the mission and highest aspirations of this institution. Today's recipient honors and distinguishes us by his presence, and through his extraordinary personal qualities and accomplishments, he sets a high standard for our own aspirations. So let us begin by asking Reverend Dr. William Barber to join me at the podium, along with Trustee Carl Bolton, Occidental, class of 1969.
Reverend Dr. William J. Barber, you have devoted your life to the struggle for social justice. As a minister, a scholar, and an activist, you have made it your life's work to speak truth to power, to mobilize people to hold our institutions accountable, and to help us all envision and fight for a more humane America. In your home state, North Carolina, you have led the fight for voter rights, just redistricting, health care reform, labor and worker rights, protection of immigration rights, educational equality, and safety from gun violence. You head the North Carolina chapter of the NAACP, the country's second largest. You are the architect and leader of North Carolina's Moral Monday, Forward Together, the largest statewide interfaith, multiracial, multi-issue coalition in the country. You are president and senior lecturer at Repairers of the Breach. You've been arrested many times for engaging in nonviolent civil disobedience. You've taken this path because, as you have often said, you are a conservative called to conserve a divine tradition that teaches us to do justice, love mercy, and walk humbly with God. It is for good reason that the Washington Post has called you a modern-day Martin Luther King. In an era of stark polarization, you are a builder of bridges, a repairer of the breach, seeking to find common ground among different groups of Americans in order to create the more perfect union that our founders envisioned. As pastor of Greenleaf Christian Church in Goldsboro, North Carolina, for the past 24 years, you have practiced what you preach in your own backyard. Under your leadership, your congregation has built affordable housing and created childcare, job training, after-school tutoring, and HIV/AIDS testing programs. Today, we are proud to honor you for your labors on behalf of all Americans, your ability to build bridges in a society increasingly riven by deep divides, and the inspiring message of faith and justice that you proclaim.
Therefore, by the authority vested in me by the Board of Trustees of Occidental College, I do now confer upon you, Reverend William Barber, the degree of Doctor of Humane Letters, honoris causa, with all the rights, privileges, and honors pertaining thereto. No. Reverend Barber, we live in perilous times. I don't have to tell you that. Now more than ever, we need your vision and moral clarity. Now more than ever, we need, as one alumni put it to me this evening, alternate voices to confront and contest an alternate reality. We very much look forward to your talk.
That's not just bad policy, it's against the common good. My friends, economic sustainability, living wages is a moral issue. Education is a moral issue. Healthcare is a moral issue. The environment is a moral issue. Addressing the disparities in our criminal justice system that impact black, brown, and poor white people is a moral issue. Protecting and expanding voting rights and immigrant rights and LGBTQ rights and women's rights and Native Americans and labor issues, those are moral issues. It's not a liberal position or a conservative position. It's immoral to sing God shed his grace on us and then refuse to shed grace on immigrants and Muslims and people who are gay. It's just wrong. And what we need to be asking of all of our leaders when all of these policies is not, is it the left position or the right position, but is it constitutionally consistent? Is it morally defensible? And is it economically sane? Teddy Roosevelt was a Republican, but Teddy Roosevelt wanted universal health care. Teddy Roosevelt wanted a minimum wage. Teddy Roosevelt wanted to protect the environment. Teddy Roosevelt supported public education. Teddy Roosevelt said we need to get our money out of politics. Teddy Roosevelt supported raising the minimum wage. What we have in this country is extremism that has hijacked parties. We have a heart problem. That's why we're moving across the country. Because way down in our hearts, we still believe that justice is right. Down in our hearts, we still believe that right can be actualized, justice can be mobilized, and meanness can be neutralized. We need a movement that refuses to accept going backwards. And I'm here to tell you the reason we got Baptists in here and Methodists in here and Jews in here and Muslims in here and folk that just believe in a moral universe is because that God or the Spirit, however you want to say it, decided that in this season he needed some social and moral defibrillators. We must shock this nation with the power of love. We must shock this nation with the power of mercy. We must shock this nation and fight for justice for all. We can't give up on the heart of our democracy, not now, not ever. Is there a heart in the house tonight? Is there a heart in the house tonight? Is there a heart in Boston tonight? Is there a heart in America tonight? Moral dissenters must stand up again today, not just in our sanctuaries of safety, but we must carry the sanctuary into the public square. Hallelujah! Thine the glory, revive us again.
Good evening, Occidental. My name is Yara Allen, and I'm with the Forward Together Moral Movement in North Carolina. And my job here this evening is very simple. It is to create an Occidental Justice Jump-Off Choir. Right? So are we ready to do that? Now, I heard that some of the best singers come from Occidental. That's what they told me. So I'd just like to get a feel for where we are in the room. If you are a soprano, raise your hand. Okay, there's hope, there's hope. If you are a soprano in the shower, raise your hand. It didn't get any better. Okay, all right. Altos, raise your hand. Let me tell you this, altos are so, everywhere I go and I ask, where are the altos? Woo, woo, woo. All right, so we're gonna find out. If you're an alto in the shower, raise your hands. Tenors. Okay, shower tenors. All right. Bass, baritone. They're the other group who are always, we'll find out. Okay, shower, bass, baritone. Now here's a special category. I don't know. No, these are some of the same people who raised your hand just now. That's not fair. Okay, so we're gonna, for those of you who are sitting next to an I don't know, and you fall in one of the other categories, loan your note out to them. But make them sign something that they have to give it back the way that you gave it to them, because that rarely happens, okay? Now I'm gonna ask that we stand together, and my statement is always that we stand together because we stand together, all right? Now, this song that we're going to do, I wrote this like in the moment when we were in North Carolina at a coal ash meeting, a town hall meeting about coal ash. And we listened to testimony after testimony of people who had been hurt by the coal ash spills. And at the end, Reverend Barber, as only Reverend Barber can do, called me up and said, Yara, close us out with a song. And after hearing all of those testimonies, those heartbreaking testimonies, I didn't have a song in me. And I walked to the podium, and this song came out. And so we've used this song all across America, and we're asking you to use it. Take this song and go with it. But now it comes with choir rehearsal, okay? So it goes like this, and it's call and response. I'll call to you and you respond. And I'm gonna call to you, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on, and your response is far too long. Yes, it's gone on. It's gone on. Somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on. And then all together we'll say, and we won't be silent anymore. Okay, now here's the choir rehearsal version. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long. Yes, it's gone on far too long. Did you hear that note? Far too long. I tell you it's gone on far too long. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long. Here we go. And we won't be silent anymore. Now, how many of you are rhythmically challenged? That's a whole other choir rehearsal. But that's all right. Okay, we're gonna do this. Are we ready? So we're gonna put the hand clap with it, okay? Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. I tell you it's gone on. Oh, somebody's hurting my brother, and it's gone on far too long, and we won't be silent anymore. Yeah, you know, somebody's hurting my sister, and it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. I tell you it's gone on. Oh, somebody's hurting my sister, and it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. It's okay if you put the harmony with it. Have you heard somebody's hurting the children, and it's gone on? Yes, it's gone on far too long. I tell you it's gone on. Oh, somebody's hurting the children, and it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. Did you know somebody's poisoning the water, and it's gone on? Yes, it's going on. I tell you it's going on. Oh, somebody's poisoning the water, and it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. Oh, if we've been just a little too quiet, you know it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. I tell you it's gone on. Well, if we've been just a little too quiet, you know it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. Yeah, somebody's banning Muslims, and it's gone on. Yes, it's gone on. I tell you it's gone on. Yeah, somebody is banning Muslims, and it's gone on. And we won't be silent anymore. And we won't be silent anymore. And we won't be silent anymore. Now let's sing it without the hand clapping. And we won't be silent anymore. Keep it going, keep it going, keep it going. And we won't be silent anymore. Last time. And we won't be silent anymore. The Occidental Jump Off Justice Choir.
Miss Yara Allen, theomusicologist. Touch two people around you and say, and we won't be silent. Now somebody shout, anymore. God help us to be angry enough at injustice that we hurt, hopeful enough in the midst of despair that we do not give up, faithful enough to stay with the task, tearful enough to cry with those who are crying, and foolish enough to believe we can make a difference. Help us and hold us. Amen. I am very pleased to be here and humbled at this great institution. Professor Dreyer called and asked me to come. As is my tradition, I said, if the calendar's fine, we'll come. We didn't talk about anything else. I didn't know anything about degrees. I didn't know what the turnout would look like. I just believe in going. And I'm quite moved tonight in the midst of the times and to see you give so much hope in the midst of where we are right now. To your president, who's been so gracious, and member of the Board of Trustees, he and his wife, and all of the good people in the back, Kimberly, my dear sister whom I didn't get to meet, who's in North Carolina, but she'll be coming back. She'll be coming back. I want to take your real questions in this moment seriously. And I want to talk about revival, resiliency, and redemption after rejection. I cannot help but think that when Dr. King came here 50 years ago, he was in a time of despair about this nation. 50 years ago, April 4th this year, he preached a sermon called "It's Time to Break Silence." He said he was not glad to call his nation the greatest purveyor of violence in the world, but it was time to break silence. And he said that on the three great issues of racism, classism, and militarism, there needed to be a moral revolution of values. In November of this year, 50 years ago, he preached a sermon entitled "The Meaning of Hope." He talked about two Americas, one that was beautiful and full of honey and blessings, the other full of despair and hopelessness. And in that sermon, he then announced and talked about plans for a poor people's campaign. A few days before Dr. King was shot, he preached a sermon, or he preached a sermon about Lazarus, the rich man who would not share with the poor man, and he said that America, like Dives, the rich man who wouldn't share with the poor man Lazarus, that like Dives, America too would go to hell if she did not deal with the issues of racism, classism, and militarism. And the sermon he sent in to Ebenezer that he was going to preach the Sunday after he was shot was entitled "Why America May Go to Hell." Now, all of these sound like dark sermons, but you have to understand prophetic preaching. Prophetic preaching first identifies the problem and then points to the pain that will be caused if the problems continue. But then prophetic preaching lifts hope out of the despair, lifts hope out of the despair, not around the despair, but finds hope out of the despair, and that hope becomes subversive to what the larger culture is believing. One of my favorite passages of Scripture is found in Psalms 118, "The stone that the builders rejected have now become the chief cornerstone." I want to come back to that. This moment in America is ultimately not about Trump or Clinton, but it's really about the rejection of some things much deeper. On January 20th, 2017, we bidded farewell to the first African-American president, a man of integrity and dignity, a man who had to endure overwhelming obstructionism, who had to endure being called everything but a child of God, who had to endure more attempts and more assassination plots than others in recent history, had to endure people trying to fight him even when he was trying to help everybody. I didn't agree with everything President Obama tried to do, but he tried. And even though he'd been called everything but a child of God until January 20th, 2017, the nation still had to call him Mr. President. And we bid it farewell to a man who this country has in some ways asked for 400 years, the son of an African and from Kenya, a white woman from Kansas, and it was not the Wizard of Oz. A black man with a black wife and black daughters in a white house built by slaves. He helped pull us out of a recession greater than anything we'd seen since the Great Depression. He attempted to do what Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, had proposed first in 1912. Teddy Roosevelt first talked about health care for all people, 1912. He hadn't done, President Obama didn't do everything right. No human does. There's some things we all wish he would have done more. Maybe he would have if he did not know the level of obstructionism and hatred. We had our disagreements, but in so many ways he tried, and we bid him farewell. And then on the 20th, we witnessed the inauguration of a con artist. Who did little to spurn endorsements, even by forces of xenophobia and white supremacy. Even KKK endorsed him. And though it is impossible to react to this moment with anything less than profound anxiety, now we see something that Maya Angelou once said: when people show you who they are the first time, believe them. He's no longer just talking about putting 2 million of our immigrant brothers and sisters out of this country. He's no longer just talking about building walls. He's no longer just talking about banning Muslims. He's no longer just talking about repealing health care. He's no longer just talking about appointing white supremacists in the White House, an anti-civil rights person as the Attorney General. He's trying to do it. And how sad it is that at his inauguration, a band played America, America, God shed his grace on thee, and then we inaugurated a president that does not want to give grace to immigrants and grace to Muslims, immigrants of which he is one, his family, immigrants. If the very rules were in place that now he wants to put in place, his own grandmama couldn't have come in the country. His own immigrant ancestors would not have been able to come past that woman standing in the harbor declaring, "Give me your tired, your poor, and your huddled man." How did we get here? This moment reveals that some have rejected some very serious principles and values. I want to talk about 4 of them. 1, some have rejected moral statesmanship and dignity for buffoonery and gamesmanship. This is how we got Trump, who is vulgarity unbounded, whose election strikes fear into the hearts of the vulnerable, the weak, and above all, the many varieties of other whom he has so deeply insulted. He ran the othering campaign, the African American other, the Hispanic other, the female other, the Jewish other, the Muslim other. He took mainstream things that all of America knows, if she would be honest, that if Obama had done one of them, let me rephrase that. If Obama had thought about doing one of them, he would have never made it out of the primaries. Trump ran his campaign sensing the feeling of dispossession and anxiety among millions of voters that the kind of political philosophy that he endorses had created. White voters in the main, and many of those voters, not all, but many, followed Trump because they saw the slick performer, once a relative cipher when it came to politics, was more than willing to assume their resentments, their fury, their sense of a new world that they believe conspired against their interests. The second thing we've seen rejected, his election shows that many have rejected real answers and real issues for lies and deflections. We see now that some in this country would rather be lied to. He just lies. It's not alternative facts, it's alternative lies. When you lie and you know there's a videotape out there that can prove you said something different, that's not alternative fact, that's an alternative lie. Normally, try not to lie like that if you're gonna lie. One paper did an analysis, said he lied 20 to 30 times a day, just lies. And in some way, he is the perverted reality of white privilege. It's amazing how many folk try to make excuses. Well, don't call it a lie. Many of his lies, the lies of Trump, articulate fears rooted in racism and classism. He offers no answers. He merely says, you are right to be afraid, very afraid. More like that look like Obama are coming. And I alone can save you. Now, I happen to be a trained theologian. The only people that, when you study the Bible, that talk like that, I alone, were Caesars and Herods. And Nebuchadnezzars and Pharaohs. You remember I alone. In an article by Sarah Sabatia, she wrote entitled, "With a Snarl, Trump Ratifies His Supporters' Rage." And she's with Tufts University. She co-authored a piece with another scholar, and he wrote a piece called "The Outrage Industry." There are people who make money stirring people up in outrage, Professor Dreyer. And she says, for a constituent that feels misunderstood and resentful, politically silenced by critics who deem their views racist, sexist, homophobic, or simply problematic, Trump proffered dignity, voice, and visibility without shame. I was telling your president in the back, when you can overtly, not covertly, when you can overtly look into a camera and tell folk, elect me, and this is how I'm going to make America great again. I'm going to take your health care. I'm going to attack the LGBT community. I'm going to attack immigrants, build walls, build Muslims. I'm going to attack Muslims. Elect me. I'm going to privatize schools, cut money to public education. Elect me. I'll take your earned income tax credits. Elect me. I will turn folk against one another. Elect me. And I'll make it easier to get a gun than it is to vote. And when you can run openly, that is a sign that we have some deep moral issues. And there are people who love a lie better than they love the truth. He said out loud, this article says, things his supporters were scorned for thinking. And they found in him a validation beyond the charismatic conservative talk radio and cable news. Trump offered up mainstream for a primetime audience, that which we thought was merely fringe. And she goes on to say, they feel as though they have been cheated and they want somebody to be held accountable. But instead of shaking their fists at global capital and the oligarchy that keeps playing us against one another, he led them in pointing their hostilities downward toward women, people of color, recent immigrants. You see, the problem with that, my friends, is that it's a real rejection of the truth. But it's covered in a strange kind of lie. You see, Trump is right. There are economic fears. The lie is, though, it's not Obama's fault. It's not immigrants' fault. It's not the Muslims' fault. That's the lie. They exist, these realities, because they are deeply rooted in the disparities of our very American history. In fact, you want to know how we struggle with this distortion? 10 of the country's 12 poorest states are in the South. That's the truth. But it's also true that the poorest counties in America, 95 of them are in so-called red states, led and represented by politicians who are the most ardent opponents of the programs that will help the poor. The truth is, as Joseph Stiglitz says in his writing, The Price and the Cost of Inequality, there are 400 of the wealthiest Americans make an hourly wage of $97,000 an hour, while we are arresting people who are fighting for 15. And so Trump is right that there's disparity, but you don't solve that problem by telling the lie that the minimum wage is already too high, as Mr. Trump said. Columbia University's Mailman School of Public Health found out that poverty and low levels of education, poor social support, and other social factors contribute for more deaths per year than heart attack, stroke, and lung cancer. 250,000 deaths a year from poverty. That's real. That's real. That's real. But you don't address that by seeding the lie that that's because of the Mexicans. See, and part of the thing with a true con is he says something that's true, but then uses that small truth to point people to lies. In fact, that's also one of the beginning stages of fascism. You don't play on people's fear that thousands of people are dying from poverty and the lack of health care and then blame their problems on the Affordable Care Act. That's a lie. That's a distortion. There's real fear out here, but to lie to people in their fear is beyond the pale. We cannot deny we have serious issues with poverty in this country. Serious issues that Democrats and Republicans and many have not taken seriously, because one of the things we did a long time ago is we stopped even using the name poor in our public discourse. These are problems. They're not the result of President Obama. They are the result of continuing disparity. Dr. King talked about 50 years ago. He said America needed a Marshall Plan for the poor that would help whites in the mountains, Appalachia, poor blacks in the Delta, and blacks and others in the urban areas, and poor whites who lost their job. Dr. King said this 50 years ago. And in the face of the lies, Mr. Trump and his allies, they sold that it's other people's problems. Rather than turning us to each other, he used lies to turn us on each other. We should be saying to him and others, you want to talk about poverty? Mr. Trump, Mr. Ryan, you really have the nerve that want to talk about party while you are part of a party that since 1968 has done everything you can to hurt the programs that help the poor? You really want to say you have the answer? But we also have to say to progressives, you cannot keep saying you're running to help the middle class. You can't keep saying that, because there are some people that are not middle class. For those of you that know your Bible, there are some people that are trying to save what Jesus wrote in Jerusalem on, and it rhymes with class. And every day they're trying to save that. It's just like we run from the word welfare. Why? It's in the Constitution. Why do we let people scare us off from using the word welfare? It's in the Constitution, promoting the general welfare. In fact, there are things that come long before freedom. You have a lot of politicians, and they'll run and say, I believe in freedom, I believe in free. Well, that's not even the first few tenets of our Constitution. The first tenet is we. The next one is repentance. We admit that we are not a perfect nation. We're trying to be a more perfect nation. And then the four things you get to before you ever get to a mention of liberty or freedom is the establishment of justice, providing for the common defense, promoting the general welfare, and domestic tranquility. And then if those things are in place, then you have a freedom worth preserving. What we should have said to Mr. Trump and those running should have said, Mr. Trump, you've told the truth. There is poverty, but here's where you've lied. You've not told the whole truth about how to deal with it. You want to know how we deal with poverty? The truth is, we could ensure economic sustainability if we would fight for full employment, living wages, alleviation of disparity of unemployment, a green economy, labor rights, affordable housing, targeted empowerment zones, strong safety nets for the poor, fair and just policies for immigrants, infrastructure development, and if we would cease warmongering that wastes money killing people rather than keeping people alive, we could fix this issue. That's the truth. You want to fix poverty? You're right, Mr. Trump. We do have a problem with poverty, but here's the part you didn't tell. You want to fix poverty? Let us ensure that every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, constitutional, diverse public education and access to community college and colleges. You want to deal with poverty? You're right, Mr. Trump, there is poverty, but the part you didn't tell is if we really want to deal with poverty, let's not only have the Affordable Care Act, let's have universal health care for everybody as a human right. Unless then people will believe the truth rather than believe the lies. But if we don't deal with this, if we don't deal with the issue of poverty, then we allow people to pimp it and then use it as a tool of division. There's a third thing. We reject it. We've seen many reject. Some have rejected true evangelicalism. And we have instead embraced a form of theological malpractice and heresy. And that heresy is called white evangelicalism. There ain't no such thing as white evangelicalism. There's no scripture for that. It's amazing to me how people want to tell me they believe in the inerrancy of scripture and then call themselves white evangelicalism. As I said, and you can't find that anywhere in the so-called inerrant scriptures. As Jim Wallace likes to say in his book on America's Original Sin, if you listen closely, this is a white brother who's an evangelical, true, but he says this, if you listen closely to the language of white evangelicalism, it's really a euphemism for white. And that's why recently I've had white students from Liberty University inviting me to come speak to them because they figured out some folk been lying to them about what the Bible really says. There's a group of Christians now that they say that the so-called white evangelicals have messed and pimped the word evangelical so bad they won't even use it. They call themselves red letter Christians. They said we don't get down to the red letters, you know, the Bibles with the red letters, what Jesus said. Yeah. And it's amazing how this so-called brand of evangelicalism in this election, this soul, whatever little bit of soul they had left, that one of them said they endorsed Trump because he was a baby Christian. Really? So you're going to put a baby Christian to run the country, really? Huh? That's like putting a baby over the church to be the pastor. Come on. Yeah. And I almost want to ask us not to laugh, but to cry. Because it's sad when you take faith and twist it up like this. One said, and this was, and all white evangelicals ain't white. I want you to get that. And all good evangelicals ain't black. There was some so-called black folk, talking about they was preachers. Of course, some of them got caught, and the news found out they didn't have the degrees they said they had. And some of them go around calling themselves doctor, and they ain't even got an honorary doctorate, let alone. Yeah, we need to call folk out. Yeah, and one of them had the nerve to say that Mr. Trump's greed and his shrewdness was an adoring quality. Yeah. We don't need that. We need a shrewd, Then another one said, he just was honest. I like this guy. He said, I'm an evangelical. I just want the meanest son of a gun who would take power and use it for what I want. Well, at least he was honest. But in doing this, they have rejected the core moral values of faith. See, there's a faith tradition that has historically helped America address issues such as slavery and lynching and segregation and discrimination and economic injustice and caring for the material needs of the poor and dealing with all kinds of injustice. But this new thing, it's really not that new, this absence of social consciousness should be concerning us all. Because what it ends up doing is becoming a chaplain to the emperor rather than a critic of the state. Many of us have major differences with those who today call themselves so-called conservatives while resisting and ignoring so much of God's character. The truth is they say so much about what God says so little and so little about what God says so much. True biblical conservatism would not do this. That's why everywhere I go, I tell people, I am a theologically evangelical, conservative, liberal, liberationist, charismatic biblicist. That loves to shout and speak in tongues. In other words, I know Jesus for myself, and I know fake stuff when I see it too. Because you see, this sort of cherry picking the easy parts of Scripture is not a new practice. During slavery, there were those who claimed deep adherence to Scripture in their support of slavery and racism. Many of them were in some of our top schools, Ivy League schools, where persons would get together and write treatises to justify slavery. I know because in one of my theological classes, I had to preach one of those sermons one time. My professor deliberately had African Americans preach the pro-slavery sermons just so we could see how insidious this is and how heretical it is and how evil it is to twist Scripture up and to use it in the service of hate. Those that pull out a few texts to build a whole system of injustice while ignoring the multiplicity of texts. You know there are more than 2,000 scriptures in the whole Bible that deal with the issue of poverty and justice and how you treat the immigrants and how you're supposed to make sure the immigrant has the same laws and same justice that you have and how we treat the least of these. But so many, just like they did in slavery, want to do a kind of 1/4 reading of the Bible to justify. Now, where did this come from? Darren Graham has written a book entitled The Blessings of Business, How Corporations Shaped So-Called Conservative Christianity. You ought to read it. And in his book, he says we have to wrestle with so-called white evangelicals and so-called conservative evangelicals and understand it is simply a religious identity shaped by money, power, corporate executives, and private sector places and spaces. And he says if you understand this, then you'll understand why white conservative, so-called conservative evangelicals fandom for a tycoon and a top-down authority such as Donald Trump. And they are willing to embrace him for the very things, in spite of the very things they condemned Obama for. He said, and he says, and this is nothing new. It's nothing new. In fact, if you go back a little bit further and read a book by Kevin Cruz, he says this form, not only did it happen in slavery time, but this form of a brand of so-called evangelicalism rose up after Franklin Delano Roosevelt pushed the minimum wages, began to push union rights and Social Security. And Frances Perkins, who was a social gospeler, was the first woman labor secretary. And she was a part of the social gospel movement that declared that the main issues that the gospel ought to be focused on in society are issues of justice. That's why Teddy Roosevelt in 1912 said that education and health care and paying people a living wage, a minimum wage, and labor rights and protecting the environment, he declared they were all moral issues because he was being pushed by the critique of the social gospel movement. So by the time Franklin Roosevelt was in office and Frances Perkins, who was a social gospeler, was there whispering in his ear, pushing him, and he began to pass the New Deal, the National Chamber of Commerce, the national manufacturers, and General Motors, and a lot of others hated. They didn't want to pay minimum wage. They didn't want to see Social Security. And so they couldn't challenge Franklin Delano Roosevelt because their capital, their authority was so in the dumps because of how they had helped bring about the Great Depression. So they polled so bad, they really had no authority. So they decided, they did a study, this is in this book by Kevin Cruz called One Nation Under God. They decided to outsource the job. They did a study and they said, let's find out who are the most popular people in the society. And they found out that the most popular people were preachers. But they couldn't have them preaching the social gospel. That wouldn't help the case. It was creating too much change. So they outsourced the job and found a person to go around and purchase preachers and pulpits. He was from Los Angeles. His name was James Fennell. He pastored a Congregationalist church here. He ministered to millionaires, and he said it was his role to debone the gospel, to take out all the stuff and come up with a simple, and here was the gospel. He perverted Calvinism and flipped it over and said, if you're good, you go to heaven. If you're bad, you go to hell. So if you're good, you're rich. If you're bad, you're poor. That was a theology. And they paid him. A lot of the corporations, major corporations. And in 10 years, he had purchased 19,000 pulpits across this country. He actually taught that it was wrong for the government to help you when you're poor because then you were overriding God's will, because if God wanted folk to be up, they would get up, and the reason they weren't up is because they weren't living right, they were immoral. And if you help people to succeed despite their immorality, you were actually violating the will of God. That's where this crazy stuff comes from. Yeah. And we have to understand that that in this culture, a lot of folk have rejected authentic faith. And that's why we've got to lift it up again. I can't find anywhere in the Old Testament, the Torah, the New Testament, the Quran, I can't find anywhere where you're supposed to use religion as a way to push down the poor. I can't find anything in the book that says that your major concern ought to be tax cuts for the wealthy and gun rights for gun owners and giving money to private schools. I can't find it. But I tell you what I can find. I can find in Deuteronomy that you're supposed to care for the stranger and the poor. I can find in the Psalms that you're supposed to relieve the oppressed because God is on their side. I can find in Jeremiah that you're supposed to take care of the children. And in Jeremiah 22, you're supposed to go down to the king's house, the king's palace, and demand that they not abuse their power. I can find in Isaiah 10, woe unto those who legislate evil and rob the poor of their rights and make women and children their prey. I can find in Isaiah 58, it says if you want to be a repairer of the breach, you must loose the bands of wickedness. And loose the bands of wickedness, translated out of Hebrew, means pay people a living wage. I can find in Ezekiel that preachers and leaders are supposed to refuse dishonest gain and refuse economic predators and are supposed to ensure economic justice. I can find in Proverbs that we're supposed to raise our voice on behalf of the voiceless. I can find Mary in the Magnificent talking about those of low estate or whom God is on their side. I can find Jesus at the beginning of his ministry saying, the Spirit of the Lord is upon me, for he has anointed me to preach good news. Wait a minute, slow down. Good news, evangel, good news to the poor. Slow down, patokos, those who have been made poor. That's what it means in Greek, by economic systems of injustice. And then I can find Jesus at the end of his life saying, one day everything's going to be judged. Every nation is going to be judged, and here's the questions that's going to be asked. When I was hungry, did you feed me? When I was naked, did you clothe me? When I was sick, did you heal me? I can't find anywhere where the primary role of a preacher or an imam or a rabbi is to ride around in your Cadillac and look down on other folk and see how quick, how close you can get underneath a president just to get you a job or a grant. But I can find plenty of scriptures that say if you get in where the president is, you're supposed to challenge them to do right, to do right, to do right, to do right, to do right by the least of these. Well, there's two more things we've seen rejected, and one of them is we've seen people reject participation in this democracy. Too many folk rejected it and said there's no need to vote. 95 million chose to sit home for something other people died for. And then others got distracted by all the craziness. And then some said, there's no way this will happen. But you cannot reject participation in this democracy. Voting doesn't solve everything, but you can't reject participation in this democracy. It's serious business. And now we have somebody in office because of 77,000 votes. 77,000 votes. 95 million sat home. Finally tonight, we have to understand that some have rejected the truth about systemic racism. And that's why I'm glad to be here tonight finally in an interracial audience. Neil Irvin Painter, the professor of history at Princeton, has written a piece called "Without Obama, There Would Be No Trump." And if we don't wrestle with this, I said this to my friend Bernie Sanders, Clinton, I said it to others, if progressives keep trying to find a way to go around race, you can't go around race, you got to go in it. If we don't deal with systemic racism, and I want to define that, something different than prejudice. I'm not talking about somebody calling somebody the N-word. I'm not talking about whether or not you are backed by David Dukes. I'm talking about systemic racism and how it's often cloaked. Y'all can tell I'm a Trekkie. How it's often cloaked. Who were those folk that cloaked? The Kleyons. If you don't deal with race, you misunderstand this whole election. She said in her article, Trump is the iconographic of a tragic, traditional American call and response, what Yara was just doing. She said the call is a challenge to the status quo. The response throughout history has been an outbreak of meanness, vile rhetorical weapons, and sometimes taking up physical weapons to put things back in place. She goes on to say that today's challenge to white people on top is the most acute in history. The election and re-election of a president who is black with a wife who was black and two daughters who were black called forth a response to this challenge early. It didn't begin with Trump. We make a mistake if we just blame all of this on Trump. It started with the vow to make Obama a one-term president. And that's the recent history. I'm going to show you how it started even before that. But it was a vow not to let him be successful in anything, refusing to govern. Look at today. We want our Supreme Court justice ratified, approved tomorrow. But never in the history of the Republic have we seen what happened last year when they sat on a Supreme Court justice nominee without a hearing. You can't understand that by just talking about party. You have to delve into the issues of systemic racism. So somebody said, well, Reverend Barber, that can't be race because the man President Obama nominated was white. Well, you forget that if you 1/16 black, you black. So if you got nominated by a black man, you're seen by, oh. Come on, let's deal with it. Like me, I'm black, I'm Tuscaroran Indian, and I'm white. But at night when the cops stop me, I'm black, baby. I'm telling you, this black thing stays with you. And then it was undergirded by this birtherism. Can you imagine what would have happened if President Obama had questioned the birth of John McCain? And then you remember when the South Carolina congressman stood up, and he didn't say, you are a liar. He said, you lie. That's an existential suggestion. You lie, your existence. This isn't right. This isn't supposed to be. And then you think about all the people that didn't respond to that or covered it up or justified it. He wasn't just talking about what President Obama was saying. He was saying something about who he was. This racism thing is real. He was saying, you're a lie. You're not real. And this thing is so deep. You know, the ambassador, the president that Trump now is putting over the UN from South Carolina, right? Now you go from Susan Rice, who's a PhD, and all of this expert ability in international studies, to a governor who has no experience, who does have foreign ancestry, but whose claim to fame is that she brought down the Confederate flag. Watch this. Which was one of the most racist acts ever perpetrated in history, when she brought down the Confederate flag. I see y'all saying, well, I thought that was pretty good. No. Because the flag didn't come down when the NAACP asked for it to come down. The flag didn't come down when the Confederates lost. The flag didn't come down after 20 years of boycotting. She brought the flag down after 9 black people were killed at Mother Emanuel. Now let me show you why that's racism. Because what that suggests is only black death matters. This thing is, and now she's the one that's going to be the ambassador. Yeah. Let's look at this thing. The countless visual stereotypes. You know, President Obama was a black president, Sister Painter says, but he was willing to embrace immigration reform and join with brown people and to care about the poor and other people of the world. He was a black person that tried in some ways to embrace the world. He didn't go around bragging about how great America was alone, as though everybody else was secondary. And so she says, without Obama, there would be no Donald Trump. And then she writes this statement: Trump is so obviously unsuited for the job of president, but he's the perfect nominee willing to answer the call of reclamation. The response to the call for justice. So another writer says Obama did not herald a post-racial America as much as he heralded a racialized one. Nor, he said many whites were hyper-aware of his election, after his election, of their racial status. The writer goes on to say, in a nation shaped and defined by a rigid racial hierarchy, his election was a radical event, a tectonic shift in which a man from one of the nation's lowest class ascended to the summit of its political landscape. And he did it with support from minorities, Asians, Latinos, Republicans, and Democrats, which meant he had the possibility of building a new electorate that scared those who want to keep the electorates divided. He broke through in the solid South, places like North Carolina, Virginia, and Florida. That wasn't supposed to happen. Black Americans turned out their highest numbers. Black females turned out higher than anybody. And so, more than simply change, Obama's election felt like inversion. Inversion of a historical hierarchy. And when you couple that, this author says, with broad decline in incomes and status of living caused by the Great Recession, it seemed like the end of a hierarchy that had always placed certain white Americans on top. And for those who lived in the worship of that hierarchy, rather than the appreciation of a democracy and a diversity, the election of President Obama was the scariest thing. See, because to accept him would mean you'd have to say your mama lied to you. As your mama told you, you might have to meet someone on a football field or baseball, or you may even, if you run for city council and government, but if you ever run for president, you can be sure if you lose, you're only going to lose to somebody who's white. Robin DiAngelo, a professor of multicultural education at Westfield State, describes what happened as white fragility. White fragility is a state in which even a minimum amount of racial stress becomes intolerable, triggering a range of defensiveness. These moves include outward display of emotions such as anger, fear, guilt, argumentation, silence, and the hope for the reinstatement of equilibrium. And see, if we don't wrestle with this, then you don't understand why it is that 94% of black women voted for Hillary, but 58, almost 60% of white women voted for Trump even after he told them what he would grab. Only 8% of African Americans and 66% of white women said they were not afraid after all. 79% of white men said, I'm not afraid. I'm not afraid. But 28% of black women said they weren't afraid. What's going on here? When one group is saying, I'm afraid of this, but the other, even after all the lies, what's going on? We have to recognize the centrality of systemic racism, America's original sin that still impacts our social DNA. The continuing reality of racism and classism connect together. When somebody says, is it race or is it class? I say, it is. You cannot separate the two. One author from Duke says, the problem is we sometimes only think about racism when somebody says the N-word, or when another unarmed young black man or woman or child is killed, which is true racism. He said, but you also have to recognize that the racism is the climate that makes the killing all right. The climate. It's also in a book, he says, there's a book entitled Racism Without Races, where the author says, we are virtually out of races today, overtly. But only the willful deaf cannot hear the dog whistle politics. And remember why we say dog whistle, because a dog whistle is meant so that only the dog hears the whistle, which means in order to understand what's going on, you got to go talk to some of the dogs. See, you'll miss it if you don't go around and hear what people hear. You may not hear it. See, when you call the president a food stamp president, that's a form of racism. That's a dog whistle. When you say the president is a juvenile, graduated from Harvard, is a juvenile, an unfit, a socialist, un-American, dog whistles. And only the dogs are supposed to hear it. But the problem is too many of us now can discern it. When Trump brought up poverty, progressives should not have been offended. You remember when he brought up poverty, even some black folk, I'm no mad that he brought up poverty. No, well, wait a minute, black folk, there are some poor folk, black people. You don't have to get offended by that. But what you need to understand and unpack is, why did he bring up black poverty in an all-white audience? What's that about? And why not go to black? Because by bringing it up in an all-white audience, you're sending a signal. Those people are the problem. It's kind of like, what was it, W.B. Du Bois that said, sometimes the problem with being black is not being a people with problems, but being a problem people. So he says this in an all-white audience as a way to drive subliminally, and not so subliminally, a message. A message. Because here's the race question in America. There are 18 million poor people, 9 million poor people. Let's just say, in other words, there are 18.9 million poor whites in this country. That's maybe a few million more now. But that means there are 8 million more poor white people than there are poor black people. And there are 5 million more poor white people than there are Latinos. That means the majority of the people benefiting from the programs like food stamps and Medicaid and Medicare are white. But 95% of the politicians who are elected in the poorest counties that are mostly white elect politicians who vote against the very programs that their constituencies need. How are those politicians fooling folk like that? What trumps common sense? That's the race question. What will make you, what conceals the truth like that? 2/3 of those who voted for Trump need health care that he's now going to repeal. There was a guy the other day, I think it's a video on it, I'm going to see if I can pull it and I'm through, it's about the Affordable Care Act, and this guy was talking about Obamacare. And you know why they named it Obamacare? That's a way of racializing it. Let's talk about it. And I don't just talk like this in an audience like this. I talk like this in Appalachia, in the mountains, in counties that are 99% white, 89% Republican, because it's time. So this guy was saying, you know, that Obamacare is bad, and it made people's premium go up, and I don't like it. And so the person said, well, what kind of health care you have? I said, well, I got the Affordable Care Act, but I don't like that Obamacare. What is it that trumps common sense? What mythology is so powerful that'll make you walk away from the very people you need to be allied with you? What is it that keeps causing that red band to run across the South and allow wealthy oligarchs who simply want to get your vote so they can siphon the tax dollars back in their pockets? What is it? What is it that keeps poor whites and poor blacks and poor Latinos from coming together who every time, what is it? What is it that causes many of my poor white and working class white brothers and sisters to vote for people who every time they get a hold of the government, they run it in the ground? What mythology makes you forget all of that and vote for them anyway? Why is it that 51 years after the Voting Rights Act, we have less voting rights protection today than we had August 6, 1965? What is it that caused 22 states to pass voter suppression? Voter fraud is alive. Voter suppression is alive. 22 states passed voter suppression law. The majority of those states are states with the highest black and Latino turnout. There were 828 less voting sites in the black and brown and poor community this last year than there were in 2012 and 14. We had 25 debates in the primary and in the general election, and not one debate on voting rights. Why is that? The Democrats don't know how to talk about race. The Republicans don't want to talk about race. And why is all this happening at this time when, I don't know if you know this, but if you take the 13 former Confederate states from Virginia to Texas, do you know if you win those states, that's 171 electoral votes. That's 26 senators. That's 31% of the United States House of Representatives. So if you can hold those and cause black and white and brown people who actually could make majorities to vote in progressive be against each other, you start out your election with 171 electoral votes to the good, which means you only need to get 99 from the other 37 states. And this is happening at the very time that if you register 30% of the unregistered black voters and got them to work with whites and Latinos, you could turn the South. And if you turn the South, you turn the nation. That's why That's why we've got to have a grown-up conversation about systemic racism in this country. That's why progressives can't make the mistake of saying, oh, we just need to have an economic message. We have to have a class and a race message. In fact, you heard me talk about the heart. Well, sometimes after you shock the heart and bring it back, you still have to have an operation. And they tell me today that you don't operate on the heart without an MRI that gives you a three-dimensional picture. We need a three-dimensional approach to America. MRI, morals and values. R, racism and discrimination. I, income and economic injustice. And then we can work on this nation. You don't go around race. You got to go into it. You got to deal with it. You got to help folk understand. And it's true what Dr. King said years ago, that the only coalition that can transform America will be for blacks and poor whites and Latinos, Asians, Native Americans, and workers to come together and form a mighty coalition against those who divide us. And my white brothers and sisters here tonight, you're going to have to help lead it. You're going to have to come south. Y'all going to have to come on down south. Huh? You're going to have to come on. You can't understand what happened early Wednesday morning, November 9th, without a race analysis. You can't understand it. And as I close, it wasn't an anomaly. It's not the worst thing that ever happened in America, because if you say that, you're going to be real offensive to a lot of people. Like people who have family members that went through slavery, or those who went through the Trail of Tears. In fact, instead of it being an anomaly, what happened on November 9, 2016 was an all too familiar pattern in the long struggle for American Reconstruction. That red band you saw from down through North Carolina and then over in the Rust Belt, the Solid South proved to be a reliable base for Trump, but he joins a long line of white men who have leveraged, fooled people in this base to get to the White House. This ain't America's first time electing a racist president. I don't have time to work you through it, but all you got to do is go back to right after the end of slavery. It was something called the Reconstruction, 1868. Within 4 years, all of the Southern legislatures were controlled by progressive bodies, many of them majority black. They began to rewrite tax laws, and make public education constitutional. They rewrote the constitutions. They changed criminal justice law. And inside of 3 or 4 years, there was a backlash. That backlash was the birth of the Klan. And the Klan wasn't first birthed to hurt black people. It was first birthed to hurt white people that were working with black people. And then there was a selection in 1877 where a man lost the popular vote. He went to the Southern delegates and said, if you all will give me the Electoral College, I'll give you a compromise called the Rutherford B. Hayes Compromise. I didn't win the popular vote, but if you let me slip on in there with the Electoral College. He compromised. He pulled the troops out of the South. He began to reshape the courts. He began to be a part of pushing and promoting racist voting laws. And by 1883, the Civil Rights Act of 1875 was overturned. There wasn't but one dissenting vote. And then in 1896, you get Plessy versus Ferguson. You get a whole host of riots. And then in 1916, 15 to 16, Woodrow Wilson plays Birth of a Nation in the Oval Office as a signal, long before Bannon was there, that white supremacy was back in the Oval Office. Then you had the Civil Rights Movement, 1954, 68. I call it the Second Reconstruction, many others do. In that time, we got the Civil Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, the Fair Housing Act, the War on Poverty. Things were moving forward. America was shifting. But then there was a backlash. George Wallace tried it, But he had too much baggage because he had said segregation yesterday, today, and tomorrow. He was too fond of the N-word. He gave a speech in 1968 in Madison Square Garden. You ought to Google it sometime. It's almost verbatim what Trump has been saying. Richard Nixon had a guy by the name of Kevin Phillips. Kevin Phillips told him, look, I can show you how to win. All we got to do is lock up the South. And the way we do that is we find out who hates who, and we find out a way to talk race without sounding racist. So we change the words. We don't use racial words like the N-word. We talk about tax cuts, entitlement reform, forced busing, infringement on states' rights. Richard Nixon used that. He barely wins the first time, but then he perfects it and he wins by landslide. And then Ronald Reagan, he uses it. He connects with the moral majority. Well, before he connects, the Koch brothers in 1973, they have a meeting and they say, we're never again going to go after Messiah candidates. We're going to build a movement that can punish any candidate that does not go our way from the bottom up. And we're going to use this Southern strategy, not just in the South, but in the Rust Belt and in the Wheat Belt and in some of the suburbs of the North. And that was before Reagan even was ready to run. And then the moral majority came along, and their whole goal was to limit the moral discussion in the public square to nothing but abortion, prayer in the school, and homosexuality. So that never again will we have a full moral discussion about poverty and economics. And Reagan announces his campaign in Philadelphia, Mississippi. And he wins by a landslide. And the very people that vote for him end up being hurt by the policies. And so Trump is not an anomaly. If you know about the 1877 compromise, if you know about the Southern strategy, then you understand that Trump just adapted it for the 21st century, but he's not the only one. Others have been using it for years. He attacked immigrants, he attacked Muslims, attacked the LGBT community. Those were political ploys based on a fundamental racial fear at the heart of the American experience. When he told Americans the last few weeks, remember when he said, I'm your last chance? That was a code word. He was talking about 2020, 2030, when the demographics shift in this country and there's no longer any one majority. I'm your last chance. You might not like me, you might not like what I've said about women and all, but I'm your last chance. And so, my friends, America must not waste time asking ourselves, how could this have happened? It happened because it's a habit written deep in our democracy. But if we are willing to see ourselves as we are and have been, we will also see that there are some other habits. And there are the habits of prophetic resistance. There are the habits of those who down through the years have gotten up from rejection. And they've been revived and they've produced redemption. And they've gotten up. We cannot afford to go around blaming each other, or saying Hillary didn't run the right campaign, or demonizing everybody. We together are inheritors of a legacy that has rejected injustice, but that's just part of the legacy. We are also the heirs of great dissenters who stood for right even when they were minority of one. We are the heirs of those who found ways to be resilient and to be revived even when they were rejected. When the Jim Crow laws of the Solid South was upheld by the U.S. Supreme Court in Plessy versus Ferguson, only one justice, Justice Harlan of Kentucky, dissented. But his dissenting opinion laid the groundwork for Charles Hamilton Houston and Thurgood Marshall and white and Jewish lawyers that eventually won Brown versus Board of Education. We can get up from rejection. Oh, yes. When Woodrow Wilson showed Birth of a Nation in the White House 100 years ago that distorted the Reconstruction, that lied about black elected officials and glorified the Klan, what happened? Ida B. Wells, W.B. Du Bois, and a white woman named Mary Wright Overland, they stood up, got up out of rejection, and challenged him. In the 1960s, on this very day, young people decided that they were going to be a part of the movement. They formed SNCC. 3 years later, they went down to Mississippi. 3 civil rights workers were murdered. But did they quit? Did they choose to run? No. Instead of young people staying out of the South, more of them came, and they pressed their way into Mississippi against brutal racism. They refused to stay rejected. And they listened to their mentor, Fannie Lou Hamer, who taught them by example that there comes a time you got to get sick and tired of being sick and tired. And even if you die, you got to decide to fall forward and never fall backwards. And Medgar Evers and others began to stand. And so after the rejection of so many important things, which is as American as apple pie, now we must apply the moral defibrillators to our own hearts. And we must shock ourselves and say, okay, that happened, but now it's time to be revived. It's time for us to stand up. It's time for us to get back fighting. I stopped by to tell you, as a preacher, we elected a mortal. We did not elect God. And the Constitution wasn't unelected. And you weren't unelected. And your faith wasn't unelected. And it's time for us to build. Let's build. Let's build interracial coalitions. Let's build moral movements in every state. Let's use moral language to shape the conversation. Let's demonstrate, if necessary, a commitment to civil disobedience. Let's build stages from which to lift the voices of everyday people that are impacted. Let's build sanctuary universities and houses and churches all across America. Oh yes, let's deal with systemic racism. Let's build broad, diverse coalition. Let's intentionally diversify the movement. Let's join hands and say we're going to stay in here forever if that's what it takes. We're not going to let each other go. And if Harriet Tubman could get 500 slaves out of slavery and she didn't have Twitter, she didn't have Facebook, she didn't have... Who are we? Let's register people to vote. Let's build a legal strategy and dust off the Constitution. Let's get the singers to come out again and the spoken word artists and everybody who has an artistic gift to begin to breathe life and hope. And let's resist and say we are not in a moment, we are building a movement. And let us say, like Langston Hughes said one time, who said the free? Not me, surely not me. The millions on relief today, the millions shot down when we strike, all the songs we've sung, all the hopes we've held, all the flags we've hung. Oh, let America be America again, the land that never has been yet and yet must be, the land where every man is free, the land that's mine, the poor man's, the Indians, the Negro, me, who made America, whose sweat and blood, whose faith and pain, whose hand at the foundry, whose plow in the rain, must bring back our mighty dream again. Sure, call me any ugly name you choose. The steel of freedom does not stain from those who live like leeches on the people's lives. We must take back our land again. America, oh yes, I say it plain, America never was America to me, and yet I swear this oath that America will be. It's time. And so, hallelujah. And so I told you that one of my favorite passages of Scripture, I told you I was coming back to that. And I'm sorry, I'm a long-winded, but I'm not a prop plane. I'm a 757. Takes me a little time to get off the runway. But that Scripture says the stones that the builders rejected has now become the chief cornerstone. In other words, God can use the rejected to produce revival. And I know in this room there are some that have known rejection. Rejection because of your sexuality. Rejection because of who you love. Rejection because of how you were born. Rejection because somebody needed somebody to hate so they could feel good about themselves. There are folk in this room that have known rejection. Rejection because of income. Rejection because of faith. Rejection because of race. Rejection because of the lack of faith. Rejection because somebody decided in their own ideology that they had a false mandate to demean your humanity and my humanity that's given to us only by God. But I want you to know tonight, if you don't hear anything else I said, that the stones that the builders rejected, you are now the cornerstones of building a new America. I want you to know tonight that when the rejected get together, we can in fact redeem America from hate and discrimination. I want you to know tonight that when hands that once picked cotton join hands of Latinos and join hands of progressives and join hands of faith and join hands of labor and join Asian hands and Native American hands and poor hands and wealthy hands and gay hands and straight hands, when all those hands get together, when the rejected come together, we are the cornerstone of building a new America. And when we join hands, we can revive and make sure that the promises of life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness and equal protection under the law and care for the common good will never be taken away from anybody or forfeited. So together, let's revive the promise. Together, let's get up from November the 8th. Together, let's ensure that hope does not die. Together, let's make sure that who's in the White House doesn't have the last word. Together, let's ensure that all of God's children are respected and treated with dignity. Together, I declare, we will redeem the heart of America. We will make sure that this nation lives out its promise. One nation under God, indivisible, 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 with liberty and justice for all. Together. If I was at church, I'd say slap somebody a high five and say together. Turn to your neighbor and say, it's on now. Somebody shout, we're coming together. We're going to fight together. We're going to march together. We're going to stand together. We're going to sing together. We're going to hope together. We're going to love together. We're going to be together. We're going to build a new America out of this rejection. Together. 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 When the stones that the builders rejected become the chief cornerstone. Yara. When we all get together, what a day of justice it will be. When we all get together, what a day of justice it will be.
When we all get together, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see justice, we will sing and shout victory. When we all get together, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see justice, we will sing and shout victory. You got it? When we all get together, what a day of rejoicing that will be. When we all see justice, we will sing and shout victory. One more time, let me hear you sing it. we will sing and shout victory. We will sing and shout victory. Great job.
So they said that they had some microphones if persons wanted to ask any questions. And so I wanted to honor that tonight. I have a request, and that is that a group of us are planning on reviving, reliving, reimagining, and re-engaging the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King did not get to finish. It's going to be called the National Moral Revival Poor People, Poor Children's Campaign. But this year, in the 50th, this year, it's going to have state components as well as a component in D.C. because we have to change the narrative. And the language of left versus right is too puny. Conservative versus liberal. There's some things that are just wrong. And we ought to be talking in those terms. So if you're interested in hooking up, and there's going to be every element of the movement, including civil disobedience and not working for poor people, but with them. And all of us, because all of us are in a certain poverty when we do not lift our brothers and sisters. Repairers of the Breach is the organization that's going to be working with the Kairos Center out of Union Theological Seminary and others. So if you go to Repairers of the Breach and sign up, you can just sign up so you can get constant emails and you can get on our Twitter and all those things that I don't know what they are, I just know people use them in my name. But there's a reason why God is calling the rejected together. Are there any questions, comments, critiques, or criticisms? All are welcome. Yes, sir. And if you would, that's a sister? I can't see.
Hi.
Hey, sister, how you doing?
I'm good. Voting rights, voter suppression. I'm a member of a group called Voting Rights Action Group. A lot of action groups sprung up after the election. And we want to be able to connect with you, work on this national thing, you know. And so I kind of wanted to know what you feel we should do. Because to me, voter suppression, you know, those few votes, the people who couldn't get there, not because they didn't want to, but because they were being kept from doing so, that might have turned that probably would have turned the election. Yeah,
Ari Bergman says in a book, he's a friend of mine, on Give Us the Ballot, and he did an article this election. Of the 868 fewer voting sites in the black and brown and poor communities, probably kept 1 million voters from the polls. And when you add to that gerrymandering, racialized apartheid gerrymandering, when you stack and pack black voters and white and brown voters so that they can't build fusion coalitions, not populists, but fusion coalitions between themselves, you actually win. That's how they win the Congresses and the legislatures. And now, particularly in the South, see, it used to be the solid South, people won by 10 and 15 percentage points. But now it's not like that. It's like 1 percentage point. And so if you can, as you say, suppress 75,000 votes, you know, you can determine the whole election. So several things. Voting rights, protecting and expanding them is one of the 5 moral issues that we list at that site, Repairers. Are you an attorney? Okay. We're going to need, on February the 11th, we're having a massive moral march on Raleigh because our state, we beat them and they still won't do right. In other words, we beat them in the court. We won a case where the court said what they were doing was surgical racism, right? Intentional, and said that the gerrymandering was apartheid intentional. We won, and in the federal court, unanimously. And they're still stalling, which is one of the reasons why Trump and them are trying to push this Supreme Court nominee. You see, because they are hoping that that person will roll back some of the victories in the lower court. But we need people that would be willing in the summers to come, because if you're concerned about California, I'm just saying, you got to be concerned about the South. We got to break, and we've got to break open and break out of that Southern strategy. And it's about numbers and voter suppression and organizing in multiple communities, and tell Democrats to stop giving up the South. You know, I used to hustle pool. I don't think y'all you didn't think I'd say that with this collar on. I used to hustle pool when I was in college. That's how I got money to take my girlfriend out, you know. And, you know, if you give me 171 head start in a 270 game, I'll take that every day. And that's what happens when progressives and others cede the South. We have to fight in the South and not think that people are just backwards. Many folk are not bad people. They've just been fed bad lies. The second thing is, if you know lawyers, we need lawyers that are willing to come and help, and firms, because listen, now, you see, after Shelby, we don't have pre-clearance. So state legislatures can pass anything, and then we have to raise the money to fight them, because in the past, they had to be pre-cleared by the Justice Department. So we had to get millions of dollars of pro bono help to win in North Carolina. In other words, they get to implement the law, they get to have elections using the bad law, and we only get to prove it unconstitutional after the fact. And that's the ugliness, and see, that has nothing to do with Trump. That has something to do with Ryan, McConnell, and Boehner have refused to fix the Voting Rights Act. Now watch this. I'm a numbers guy, you know. The Voting Rights Act was gutted June 25th, 2013. Somebody get your phone out. I'm going to show you something. June 25th, 2013. Now do one of those calculators that will calculate from that day to today while I'm talking. Now the 15th Amendment says the Congress, only the Congress has the right to protect voting. That's what the 15th Amendment says. They have a right. So when the Supreme Court they gutted Section 4, nullified Section 5, and they threw it to the Congress. The Congress has to come up with a new what's called Section 4 formula to figure out which states are still going to be covered based on continuing discrimination and voter suppression. So since June 25th, anybody got that? How many days? No, 3 years, 7 months. More than 8 days. How many? That's 365 times 3. No, it's 15. Say what? One what? 13, over 1,300 days. The Congress has refused to do its job. Now let me give you another number. How long, you want to see racism? How long did Strom Thurmond filibuster the Civil Rights Act of 57? 1 day. They have filibustered fixing the Voting Rights Act 1,300 days. That's 1,299 days longer. And you know Strom Thurmond was a racist. Of course, he, except, he wanted to hang around white women and have black babies, but he was a racist, which is another thing we need to know about racism. You remember when they were talking about the Attorney General? He's a nice guy. And one of the black guys said, well, he came, and visited me when we were having a baby. And I wanted to say to him, bruh, I'm glad that he came to visit you, but that's not what we're talking about here. Being nice. Because if that's the standard, the slave master visited the slave hut when the women were having babies. Strom Thurmond had black babies. Jesse Helms, hired black people. That's not how you discover racism. You have to look at policy. So we need that. So let's hook up, okay, and connect with repairs. And if some of you all really want to come down and do some work in the South and some of those areas, it's a critical. And I'm not trying to say you don't have some same things in California and other places, but we know that right now the battle for America, people want to say it's just Michigan, Wisconsin, Ohio. No, it's not. ever since, it's always been the battle of the South. And President Obama's election, that's why all this stuff's happened, showed that you can break through in the South. And you don't even have to break through in every state. If you can break through in Virginia, North Carolina, Georgia, Mississippi, and Florida, that's a whole new American electorate. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Don't I know you? You look like a guy from Goldsboro. Okay, the mic, we need a mic real quick. Is that helpful, my sister? Okay. Because you can do what my daughter tells me. Shut up, Dad.
I agree with your analysis about the 171 electoral votes in the South, but I'm from Southern California, and we have a Los Angeles Unified School District that 63 years after Brown versus Board of Education is over 90% Black and Latino, and you walk into those schools with 50% truancy rates, 70% failing at junior colleges. These kids are being set up to fail. If we want to address racism, we have to address it in integrated schools. Could you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. In fact, you heard me say that one of the things we have to do is have a commitment to make sure every child receives a high-quality, well-funded, diverse public education constitutionally. So it is a shame that all these years after Brown, resegregation is happening at a higher rate than it did in the 1970s. And it's not just resegregation. And the thing we have to do when we talk about it, people say, well, it doesn't matter what bodies that are in the chair as long as they have the same resources. That's Plessy versus Ferguson. You're never going to have the same resources in segregated reality. So resegregation is not just about resegregation of bodies, but resegregation of books, resegregation of teachers, resegregation of access. So again, in our moral framework, we say there are 5 fundamental issues: the economics piece, the education piece, the healthcare, the criminal justice piece, the voting, and the equal protection piece. They all are together. In other words, you can't separate one out from the other. And so those are critical, and we know that, one of the things that's happening now with this, trying to put Ms. DeVos, who knows nothing about public education, but we had a good thing to happen. 2 Republican ladies said no today, right? Okay, but we know that the whole, charter, that the school movement that she's leading is about resegregation. Really, it's about resegregation, and it's about extracting the public tax dollars to private corporations. Right. So I agree wholeheartedly with your analysis that I was listening to CNN one night, and somebody began to talk about racism, systemic racism, as part of the explanation for this problem with this election. Not just this election, but even things beyond this election. But they were speaking specifically about this past election, and the commentator says, that's too easy. And I wanted to jump through the TV and say, you really think racism is easy? And I tell you something that we're hearing now that we got to be very careful of. Progressives talking about they want to move away from identity politics. See, it keep coming these little code words. We should want to identify the hurting and the broken and the resegregation. We should want to identify, because until you identify it, you can't fix it. Because not to identify is a form of attention violence. Huh? Right. But the resegregate, that's right. Which is why part of our Poor People's Campaign, we're going to do a race class audit that's going to come out. The preliminary report's coming out in April. And then we're going to broaden it. We've got to do the intersections since '68 of where we are, race, class, so that we have, because I don't believe in being loud and wrong. You need a footnote. So we're getting some of the best economists and social scientists and all to come together. And what we're going to say is our narrative. I think that was a problem with the way this campaign that was just run, it got caught up in innuendos and insults. And even the Democrats, when they often wanted to talk about race, they would run to David Dukes. They wouldn't raise what you're talking about. And until we have a grown-up conversation that's intersectional around schools and health and whatnot, to show not only the impact on black people, but how But how racist, like I told somebody, there was a guy that was on TV the other day, and he was talking about Trump, and he said, I thought we could trust him. And I said, you thought you could trust a racist? I mean, you know, how do you trust a racist? That's an ideology built on lies. So what made you think that he would treat the others wrong and then treat you right? All right, okay. So what we're arguing is exactly what you're saying, is that we have to have an intersectional approach. And one of the things I cringe with the Democrats is, you know, the things that were allowed to slide, you know, the voter suppression piece, we never really came up, the resegregation piece. Even living wages. You can't analyze the fight for 15 with just a class argument. You fight for 15. Well, there's 64 million Americans that make less than 15 an hour. So that's a class issue. But 54% of African Americans make less than 15 hours. That's a race issue. So you can't find a way to get around it. You know, it makes perfect sense to me when I go on the dark side. You know, because sometimes you got to go to think, you got to really, you know, what kind? Because it makes sense to me that the same week you bring up the lie about voter fraud and then say it's happening in the urban places, that you also signed a ban against Muslims and have major conversation about the wall, because all three of those things are projected as being at black and brown people. See, that, to me, if I go on the dark side for a minute, the procession is just right. You lie about voter fraud, that's sitting in a dog whistle. See, that's a lie, and you code word in there and every night in the urban centers. So to folk that hear the dog whistle, that means the black folk cheating. The only reason, the whole thing about voter fraud didn't come up till Obama won, because that was a way of saying he didn't really win. All right, then you do the ban against Muslims or certain refugees in certain countries where you don't have business ties. Right? Then you talk about the wall, but you only talk about in terms of Mexican, because even that's a racist connotation, where you're trying to split the Latino community. And then you appoint an extremely conservative, nominated extreme. I mean, the procession fits, which is why I keep saying this. We can't act like this is something strange in the American construct. It has happened before, maybe not the same way, but the same elements in the procession. But people have also fought it and beat it back before, and that's what our calling is. Well, I don't see any more. Yes, ma'am. Yes, that sister right here, and then that sister right here. If y'all could, you do them real. Let me see. Oh, I got to catch a 3 o'clock flight. So can we do it real quick? Yes, ma'am. Okay, good. Go ahead.
Hi, I really appreciate your talk. Thank you for coming.
Who is that talking? I can't see you.
Hi.
Oh, there he is. Okay.
So very recently we had some student activism on campus that was part of the wave across the country with college students kind of participating in nonviolent action. And so
around what issue?
Particularly race, but on this campus we also had issues with sexual assault and sexual violence. So the students occupied the main administrative building for a week.
Sound like me when I was young.
Yeah.
Grr.
So my question is, or I guess I'm asking you if you could talk on student activism now and where you would like to see that kind of going moving forward.
Yeah. Well, you know, if you know the history of our country, student activism has always been extraordinarily important. People say, for instance, on February 1st, 4 students sat down, A&T students sat down at the lunch counter. Actually, that's not altogether true. It's true that they did, but the organizing started at Bennett with the sisters. And in 1948, the sisters had taken over one of the movie theaters long before it happened. So this notion of youth activism, what I want to say to young people now is, I think we need a political Pentecost. And by Pentecost, I mean is when the young and the old and all find a way not to be at odds, but to be together. I think we're in a season where the old, I'm gonna say old, where the old folk got to suit up one more time. Those of us that living off of the sacrifices of the past have to suit up. And those who have never thought about suiting up have to suit up. We need everybody, all hands on deck. And then we need to choose. This is what I would say about student activism. I remember one time we were in school and the cafeteria had bad food. But they also were denying us a voting precinct on campus. We had to decide which battle was the important one. And so I think, how do you go from the student activism that is right, because you have to make sure your home territory, you can't ignore injustices, whether it's on a college campus or in a church or whatnot, but also in this season, I'm convinced that we have to build these moral movements in every state, indigenously led, not helicopter in. Like I tell people, I will not come to a state to lead a movement. I'll come to a state to teach people what we've learned. I'll come to a state to share. But you can't, helicopter leadership doesn't get it. People, one of the interpretations around the way Hollywood has glamorized the civil rights movement is, Dr. King said he was going to do a speech and everybody came to D.C. The fact of the matter is there were 300 different cities and communities where local people were activated, were going to jail around the country. Bayard Rustin, who was a gay brother, was a master strategist. And even after the march, there was a direction: go back to Mississippi. Go back, in other words, go back local and build up. And the other thing we have to be careful of is we had one time 80,000 people show up in North Carolina to a moral march on Raleigh, the biggest march since Selma. But that's not going to happen all the time. So you've got to be able to organize in a way that's deep and that deepens, that grows, that has strategic targets. Just can't be shotgun blast all over the place. Why are you doing this? When we started the Moral Monday movement, we got in a room and asked different groups, what thing, if you wanted, would be transformative to your movement? And they listed them. We said, now what power entity is blocking it? And almost everybody listed the state legislature. And then we said, what legislatures? And almost everybody listed the same one. And we said, now step back. Said to the LGBTQ community, you said those legislators are voting against you? Mm-hmm. To the voting rights community, you say the same legislators are voting against you? Mm-hmm. To the environmentalists, the same ones voting against you? Well, if they are cynical enough to be together, why aren't we smart enough to come together? So how do we have silos but not be isolated to those silos? So to my young brother, I would say, build from the movement on the campus and begin raising the question, what is my place in the movement now to transform not just the campus, but history itself, and to transform the country, And we'd love to have you as a part of the building the Moral Revival Poor Children's Campaign. We're going to need a lot of help, and we're going to need an anchor. Maybe Oxy could be an anchor right here in Los Angeles. I'm just saying, I don't know. Since I got a doctorate and stuff from here, I can say stuff like that. Anybody else? You got one more? I can take one more, and I got to get off these old legs of mine.
I've got one.
My man.
Just wondering, with Trump's use of Twitter and you know, his sort of method of approaching the press with what I have, you know, understood as the sort of preemptive framing of issues, in which he's getting so far ahead of the conversation, excuse me, that he's controlling the entire narrative. So what I'm wondering is, with those sort of dog whistles, how you can disrupt that so that, you know, you're winning some of his supporters over without alienating them at the same time. So how can you disrupt that narrative and kind of take that back?
Yeah. Well, I think we have to become, and we're going to need many of you that are good at that, to become as shrewd, become as skilled, you know, because, you know, he don't own Twitter, so we ought to be using it too. And all of social media, but then we need to go a step further. He might tweet, but they didn't win with tweets. They ran by this thing I mentioned, how the Koch brothers in '73 decided on a whole plan of organizing from the bottom up. And what you said, go to people. So what I found is you have to go. In these states, and there might be places, I suspect there are places in California, some of you always say, Lord, them folk over there just crazy. But you can't write them off anymore. I mean, watch this. 67% of folk in West Virginia voted for Trump. But now they're marching in West Virginia because they didn't realize he meant what he said about cutting health care. Guess where some of us getting ready to go? Exactly. Exactly. So we need persons that can do the tweet, but we also need people that are willing to travel and willing to go in and build. In fact, in my book, Third Reconstruction, it lists 14 things, and one of those things is people think the Moral Monday movement just happened because some folk went in and got arrested. We had been building for 10 years. The 3 years that you know about was built on 7 years. And we went in, the first group wasn't but 17 people. But it was 7 clergy, a woman with cerebral palsy, and they made the mistake of arresting us. We didn't go to get arrested. They made the mistake of arresting us, and they arrested the woman in the wheelchair, and it went all over the newspaper. And then and the first 6 weeks, they called us morons. The papers were against us. But after the 14th week, the papers started writing editorials saying we were right, because we created a tension moment to shift the narrative. You can't out-tweet him, so you got to create another narrative. So watch this. I'm just saying, I'm not telling everything, but what if you had a poor people's campaign, poor people and poor children, you had an agenda, and you were able to get 40 states, maybe California to be one of them, and you had people, you know, 500,000 people organized in a way that they were in the state capitol for so many weeks demanding this full agenda, and at the same time you had people in Washington, D.C. Dr. King only wanted 3,000 people. He said, if I can get 3,000 people organized in D.C., we can shift the narrative. Now, I'm not just talking about, you know, delivering message. I'm talking about doing serious, what that guy say, y'all occupied? What if we occupied, but it was around a real strategy? And what if it happened in multiple places? Then you force the media into a whole new conversation. See, we have to build some movements that have more than a one-day news cycle. And I can tell you what we learned, and it was work, God knows. We had over 200 Moral Monday events, both at the Capitol, around the state, places people never thought. But if we had not, it took time to shift that narrative. If we had just gone in one time and got arrested and left, it was just, we actually ended up controlling the news cycle for weeks. We set it up so that on Monday, folk got arrested. On Thursday, the folk got arrested, had a press conference. On Friday, the folk that were going to get arrested had a press conference. On Monday, the people had a press conference that were going to get arrested on Monday. And then on Thursday, the folk that got arrested. I mean, it was a whole social media piece over 3 years. And PPP polling said if it had not been for that, what she told y'all happened in North Carolina, where in North Carolina, Trumpism couldn't go deep. He won, but he won only by about 100,000 votes. We can trace thousands of votes that were suppressed, but he didn't have any coattails because there was a movement that had been in existence not for an election. We didn't build a movement for an election. We built the movement for transformation. And so in the South, Trumpism loses, where they expected him to win, and he loses. He doesn't lose, but the governor loses, the Secretary of State loses, the Attorney General loses, and a black man wins 76 counties and becomes a Supreme Court justice in North Carolina, and it never happened before in the history of the state, which proves that you can win in counties that are not considered quote-unquote liberal counties, because he won 76, and there's only 100 counties in North Carolina, and he won by 350,000 votes. His margin of victory was bigger than Trump's. But that doesn't just happen as, just by having a rally. It happens through strategic, and if you miss anything else tonight in this conversation, go back and read, not this Hollywood version, but read the real version. The civil rights movement, they had campaigns, not rallies. They had campaigns. And I'll tell you this, if you think that Rosa Parks sat down on a Thursday and those ladies went in and mimeographed 50,000 flyers in one night on that old mimeograph machine that you turn like that, I got some bridges I want to sell you. That may be what they tell us, but that was planned, and it was strategic. In fact, there's one book that says the way they did it so that they wouldn't even give the preachers time to get scared. Said if she'd have sat down on Monday, by Wednesday, the preachers might have been scared. She sat down at the end of the week, so it, boom, hit by Saturday, Sunday, it was in the church, Monday, and it was strategy. And that's why in this moment, don't be rushed to do everything now. Let's stand up now, but also be prepared to run a marathon. We are just 12 days in. We are just seeing the opening volleys. And don't get discouraged. Get mad, get angry sometimes. I get angry because you don't have to sin because you get angry. Anger means and grief. But despots and arrogance will always make mistakes. Pride cometh before the fall. We have to remember the race is not given to the swiftest nor to the strongest, but to they that endure to the end. Let's work, Oxy and other places, on building an enduring movement, not just for 218, not just to put more Democrats into office, but to change the course of history. That's our goal.
I want to thank all of you for coming, and we're going to give Reverend Barber a chance to rest for a minute, but he will be signing books in the lobby.